So, my name is William Thompson, and this is Fred Vipperman. The date of our interview session is 11/22/2017, and the location is
the Anderson Law Firm, Fred Vipperman's office.
all right. And the proposed subject of this recording is 60s and 70s, specifically John F. Kennedy, college years, and the LBJ's legislation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then just some more things dealing with the community and everything else around him and his perspective looking back on it now. All right, so to begin, we'll just get some personal information. Trying to figure out where to put this at, but that should work, right?
Okay, do you want me to start talking about things that were the most striking to me?
Well, I was going to go through...
You have a question?
Yep, I have personal information just to gather, so then they, as people looking back on it, can understand you a little bit more.
Very well.
So, just to begin with, when and where were you born?
I was born in Central City, Nebraska, January 30th of 1950. And the hospital I was born in doesn't exist anymore. It was torn down.
Oh, really? Did your parents grow up there originally?
No. My dad grew up in Osmond, Nebraska, and my mother grew up in Chapman. And she was actually born in her own home.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What were their names?
My dad is William F. Vipperman, and my mother's name was Elizabeth June Knight Vipperman.
Okay. And
her maiden name was Knight.
Knight. Yeah. So, did you live in Central City for a long time?
No, we never did live in Central City. My whole life, and where I still live is on the family farm, which is north of Chapman.
Okay.
I was born and raised there, and that's where my parents lived and worked until they both passed away.
Yeah. And you have siblings, right?
My sister. Elizabeth, she's 7 years older than I. She was born in 1943.
Okay. What did your parents do for work?
Well, they did a number of things. They both taught school originally. They both taught in the same country school. One taught the younger grades and one taught the older grades. Then my dad went into farming, and he basically farmed my mother's grandfather's farm, and that's where I still live. And then my mother, she got a degree from the University of Nebraska from the Teachers College, and then she taught for many, many years, including actually being named as the outstanding educator in Grand Island, I believe, in 1973.
Yeah. Would you say that this shaped your childhood quite a bit?
Well, it shaped my childhood a lot because there was a lot of communication in our house at all the times, especially around lunch times or supper times. My parents constantly would talk about events that were going on, how my day went. There was a lot of interaction between us. They didn't subscribe to the theory. The theory at that time were children are to be seen, not heard. And so sometimes we'd go other places for like Christmas celebrations or Thanksgiving celebrations, and it would strike me as very odd that a lot of the children in the other homes wouldn't ever get to say anything or wouldn't say anything. They just sat there. And that wasn't the way it worked at our house. There was always encouragement from my parents to talk, to contribute ideas, even at an early age, to see what my feelings were about things. And we had a very good relationship that way.
Yeah. So I guess going off of that, and with sort of the kids that you notice just going, say, Thanksgiving and places like that, do you describe sort of that same thing in Chapman with like peers growing up, or just overall, how was your childhood growing up in Chapman?
Oh, my childhood growing up in Chapman was great. My dad at that time had left the farm, and he was working at the Chapman Elevator, which eventually he became the manager of the Chapman Elevator. So when I got a little bit older, like in my 6th or 7th grade, a lot of times I'd go over to the elevator and unload train cars. So pig feed, cattle feed came in 50-pound bags. And a lot of times my dad would call me and I'd get a chance to make extra money, even though I was still in grade school, by spending 3 or 4 hours over at the elevator at night. Sometimes I'd sweep up the alleyway to get, excess corn that spilled that didn't go down in the elevator. And so it gave me a great opportunity. The other thing is, at that same time, my mother was teaching at the grade school. In fact, she taught me in the 5th, 7th, and 8th grades. And so she didn't usually go home to the farm. She'd usually work after school a couple hours, at least an hour and a half every day. So sometimes if I didn't go work at the elevator, then I'd get to play with the kids in town. So I had quite a few friends, even though out in the country there weren't many friends. But I always had fun. I could either go at the elevator and work, especially when I was a little bit older, or stay in town and play and wait until my mother went home from work.
I guess that kind of answers part of my next question, which is, what was the relationship between you, your family, and the community of Chapman like? I guess if you would like to emphasize maybe a little bit more about how your interactions were with peers, or...
Well, a strange thing. I was a little bit worried, as I'm sure my mother must have been, how the other children and their parents would take the fact that my mother was teaching me. Like, would I get special benefits, or would I be treated better, or things I did wrong ignored? And I think I had a heightened sense of responsibility, so it actually ended up it was never a problem. Not that I ever knew, at least I was expected to study like the other kids. I was expected to behave. And I figured that if I got in trouble at school, I'd probably be in worse trouble at home with my dad, although he was a very calm, decent man who would never lay a hand on anybody, even though he was a boxer when he was young in the armed services, and a college football player when he was young. But I think there was just that expectation in the home that I would do things right at school, especially with my mother there, not to bring embarrassment to her.
Yeah. So, what was sort of like, would you say, sort of the culture like in Chapman at the time you were growing up in this age?
Well, there was a lot of interesting things about the culture. Especially interesting to me was the fact that, like, when I was 5, I'd have been a kindergartner. But the World War II was only done 10 years then. So a lot of the men in the community, especially, were World War II veterans. And to me, they had a very interesting perspective, at least the ones I knew, on life. It seemed to me that they had been through so much hardship, and I knew veterans from both the European theater of World War II when I was little, and from the Japanese theater. And it just seemed to me that they had seen so much hardship and so much pressure that they didn't get argumentative over little things. They didn't nitpick over small things. It just seemed like their contact with serious things had been so great that they were very good-natured. They didn't argue with each other. They helped each other. And so a lot of the way I try to think was based on the fact that a lot of World War II veterans were very good to me as a child. They were friends of my dad, some farmers, neighbor farmers. They'd take me hunting if my dad couldn't. They'd take me out in the fields if I wanted to make a little extra money irrigating. At that time, see, we didn't have center pivot irrigation, so irrigation was kind of new. A lot of the ground had been leveled, machine leveled, so water could run by gravity. And there was a lot of work to that. We didn't have even, when it first started, we didn't have irrigation pipe. Dig ditches, and then you'd set tubes. So that was one of my favorite things in the summer, was to go out and set tubes, but I'd go with neighbor farmers. I'd get to make a little money, and it was a good time to grow up, I think.
Yeah. Would you say, with growing up that way, that it contributed to you in your adult life now?
I beg your pardon?
Would you say that sort of those experiences at that time, say working or with those men you speak of, did it have a good impact on you now in your adult life?
Yeah, it had a big impact on me because at that time, it just seemed to me that there was no shortcuts to success. I mean, the old axiom, you get what you work for, was still in place. And actually, it's one of the reasons that tonight, the night before Thanksgiving, I'll still be working here at 7 o'clock.
Yeah.
And that's just an example. Work has never been foreign to me. Work was integral to our lifestyle.
Well, it kind of sums up the personal information I was looking for. It's
Okay.
good. Now we'll just start moving into first subject. We'll be talking about John F. Kennedy and his presidency and the assassination. Just to begin with, for some context, how old were you during John F. Kennedy's presidency?
Well, I was 13 when he was killed. I was born in January of 1950, and so I turned 13 in January of 1963, and he was killed on November 22nd of 1963. So I was 13, and I was in the 7th grade.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget it because my mother was my teacher in the 7th and 8th grade, and one of my classmates who later served in Vietnam, Larry Rudolph, his mother was really a really nice mother. She'd bring things to the school for the kids, like cookies on special occasions and things. And I was sitting in class where I could see people walk up the staircase, and I saw her coming up the staircase, Mrs. Rudolph, and so I thought probably she was there to do something for the kids, because she always did a lot of nice things for the kids. And my mother stepped out of the classroom and took a brief moment to talk to her, and when my mother stepped back in the classroom, she said, "Something terrible has happened." And at that point, she informed us that President Kennedy had been killed in Dallas, Texas, and it was a real shocking thing, because for any president to get killed. But I mean, we know Lincoln got killed in the Ford Theater, but that's so far distant to our life. But to have a contemporary president, contemporary to our own young life, killed, it was unthinkable. Nobody had ever heard of it. And it set off a real emotional catharsis, I think, among not only young people, but people all over the United States, that this kind of thing could happen in the United States.
Yeah. What was, can you remember how, people in your class felt, just kids your age? How was it?
Yeah, they were all shocked and they were saddened, because President Kennedy was the youngest president. And a lot of people, young people, could really liked him because he was young, and just they could identify with his youth, and it hurt everybody's feelings. I mean, I didn't know anybody that was, even elated at all about it. It was terrible. It was a tragedy. It was a national tragedy.
Yeah. I think you answered about 4 of my questions there, so I got to figure out where I'm at now, but that was good. Yeah.
I will tell you something else about that was almost unbelievable. It was either the day after President Kennedy was shot, or maybe a day later, that we were all watching national television. Most people were glued to the TV set for days over it. And I actually saw on television Jack Ruby kill Lee Harvey Oswald at what they call real time now. I don't know what real time means, but when it happened, we saw it. And we were watching TV. We couldn't believe it.
Where were you guys watching it at?
At home.
At home,
on a black and white TV.
Yeah, everyone in your family there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We couldn't believe what we were seeing.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a lot going on after. It seemed like just plenty of assassinations followed afterwards.
And then, of course, the funeral and the days of mourning and all that, the body laying in state, and Washington D.C. And especially the famous photograph of his little boy John F. Kennedy, who later perished himself in a plane crash, saluting his dad's casket, was an unbelievable vision. I think that most people that were alive at that time still it's imprinted in their mind.
Yeah. Would you say that, like, that was a moment like that, growing up, being 13, had a lasting impact on your perception, say, growing up and getting to college afterwards?
It did have a lasting impression on me, because I think it brought home the fact that long lives aren't guaranteed. Accidents happen, murders happen, diseases set in on people. When you're young, you think you're, quote, bulletproof, I guess. It's probably a poor analogy in this case with a rifle assassination, but it brought home to me the reality that life is a lot of chance involved in it.
Yeah. Especially when the most powerful guy in the country
It's gone.
Yeah. Guess here, I do have a little bit more questions on this subject. So we kind of talked a little bit about how the community felt in Chapman. I guess I was trying to just aim a little bit more to specifics. At that moment, can you relate how, say, the feelings in your community were towards, say, politics
I think,
after that assassination?
The election between President Nixon and President Kennedy was a very, very close election. Some people, I think, just a second.
Okay, we had to take a break there. So we're going to continue with the question on reflecting on what the feelings were towards politics in Fred's community after the death of John F. Kennedy.
Well, I can use my parents as an example. They were, unlike me at this time, of course I wasn't registered to vote when I was 13, but they were staunch Republicans. But it saddened them markedly that President Kennedy had been assassinated. Even though I would suspect they voted, although I never asked them, for Richard Nixon in that election, it just seemed to me at that time we didn't have the divisiveness in politics where people would make smart aleck comments like, well, probably good riddance or something like that. Yeah. To me, I never met one person in my community who thought it was any nice thing that happened. They all were very sad about it. The people generally, even if they didn't vote for President Kennedy, I think admired him. I think they liked him.
Yeah. Yeah, he sort of had that appeal about him that just...
Yeah, people put their political beliefs aside when it came to murdering the most powerful man in the world at that time.
Yeah. Well, we got a lot done there with John F. Kennedy. Went through my questions pretty fast there. Now I think get into a pretty important subject that probably hit home is college years, the draft, Vietnam, and student movements.
Well, that definitely was a big thing, especially in my life. It's the one thing, you mentioned the draft, it's the one thing that I have a little regret about, personal regret. As I look back on it, the draft was very unfair to poor students, and I'll tell you why. I didn't even think about it at the time. I took advantage of it because it was the law of the land, but I don't know why it didn't dawn on me how very unfair this was. The law was that if you were a full-time college student, you could, in good standing, you would get a 4-year deferment from the draft. So you registered for the draft, I think, usually when you were a senior in high school. But if you were a full-time student, then the draft didn't apply to you during those 4 years. But when I look back at it, a lot of the kids that wanted to go to college, who could have taken advantage of the deferment, couldn't because they were too poor to enroll in college. And so I do regret, now that I look back at it, I do regret that the poor suffered inordinately. At least as the war went on a long time, so a lot of the people that took advantage of the draft still got drafted.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of us that didn't because of that deferment. And I think that was unfair, now that I look back at it, because poor kids couldn't go to college and take advantage of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely. Just for some context here, and just so we know where you were at when you were in college, talk about high school a little bit in the sense of, when did you graduate, and then when did you know where you'd be attending college?
Okay, I graduated from high school, Grand Island Senior High School, in May of 1968. And within a few days after graduation, I started the University of Nebraska in summer school. Dan Eakes, he's a well-known Nebraska businessman, and I lived together. He's one of the founders of Eakes Office Solution, he and his brother, Ron. And he and I went directly to the university basically from graduation. And so I started in the summer of 1968, and I graduated 4 years later, 1972. To graduate, though, I'd taken summer school, I think, twice, so I didn't have to take excessive hours. Yeah. So when I graduated, then, of course, my deferment, to relate back to that question, ended. And what happened was the government, when I say the government, instituted a number system. And I remember that we all hovered around in a dorm room, and it was like a Powerball lottery. They had ping pong balls with every date of the year stamped on them, and they had an evening where they started to pull these ping pong balls out of a big air-driven, just like what you see in 20th Powerball. But anyway, big old tub of numbers flying around, and they'd grab one out. Well, whatever that first date was, and I don't remember now, anybody that was draft eligible that had lost their deferment or didn't have a deferment, everybody that was born on that date, they all got drafted first. And I remember I was in a room with a few people that got picked within the top 10 numbers. And they knew that the minute their deferment ended, they were gone. I stayed up, and my number was in the 150s. And so when I graduated from college in 1972, undergraduate, and I was in my freshman year in law school, you'd look in the paper. And what would happen is they'd have the number in the paper, the date that they were drafted on. And they were up, I think, in the 130s maybe, and I called my parents, and I said, the way it's going, I'll bet I'm in law school maybe one more month before I get yanked out. Because I had friends in law school that had got pulled out already to go into the armed services. And I was close to being pulled out. And one night I was studying in the library, and I heard a roar go off in the library, and President Nixon had come on national TV, and he ended the war and the draft. And that's why I escaped, I guess, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
Ever having to serve in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Although everybody that got drafted didn't serve in Vietnam. Some got sent to Europe or other jobs in the United States in support of the military. But I've always considered myself really lucky at that point.
Do you have specific friends, say, that were going to school with you that you can remember exactly how they felt before they went? Or?
Oh yeah, I had a real good friend from senior high school, Bob Seymour, and he got sent to Vietnam. I think he spent a lot of his time in Thailand, but he was in that group, and he got, he had to join the Army or get drafted.
Yeah.
Because of the numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And on the campus as a whole, what was sort of was there an overall feeling of just fear around or anxiety about this issue?
There was a lot of anti-war movement stuff going on. And there were, in Lincoln itself, and I can't speak to the other colleges in Nebraska, but I was at the university. And especially in, I want to say 1969, I think that's when the United States invaded Cambodia. There were huge, thousands of students and others, citizens, professors, all walks of life parading down, I was one of them, on O Street, in huge anti-war protests. And then it started to ignite all over the United States. And there were two theories about it. One was that if you're involved in these protests, you're anti the United States, because what you're doing is that you're giving the North Vietnamese encouragement to keep fighting, okay? Yeah. The other view was, if you don't protest, this war is going to go on forever, and the North Vietnamese are never going to quit. So you're actually, if you can get the government convinced to pull out of the war, you're actually saving lives. One theory was the protests were getting people killed. The other theory was it will save lives down the road. I think history shows that the second view was correct. That the North Vietnamese were not fighting and continuing to fight because of protests in the United States. They were continuing to fight because of an ultra sense of nationalism, reunification of their country. And I think that the protests in the United States had very little, if anything, to do with the outcome of that war. Now, and I'm not just saying that to clear my own conscience, because I was one of those protesters. But I think that the proof of the fact is that the North Vietnamese would have fought that war until death, regardless of whether there were protests on the streets of the United States. I guess God only knows the answer, the real answer to that question, but they were resolved to win that war no matter what.
Yeah. And so there was protests, you're saying, on O Street.
Oh yeah.
Can you remember like how that was organized? If there was a specific like person or group of people?
I don't remember how it was organized. I mean, I think that just the word went out. We didn't have all this electronic communication that we have now, but I think the word would just go out mouth to mouth. Hey, there's going to be a big march down O Street or down through the central part of Lincoln at such and such a time. If you want to get involved, be there. That's about it.
Yeah. Can you remember like specific students like that would say be like resistant to this march that you?
This sounds strange, and maybe it's just that I hung around with other people, but I don't remember much resistance to it. I mean, I don't remember anybody saying, "Well, you're a traitor," or "You're a chicken SOB," or anything like that. I think the sense in the educated community, especially the educated communities around the United States, was that this war was rapidly being shown to be a colossal mistake.
Yeah.
It was based on what was called the domino theory. And the domino theory was that the domino theory of communism, that if China was communist, Russia was communist, and then Vietnam, a neighbor of China, fell to communism, then the next countries would be Japan would turn communist, but it was totally debunked because the Vietnamese were dead mortal enemy of the Chinese, even though the North Vietnamese and Chinese were both communist countries. So the domino theory that the war was predicated on, I think, has been totally debunked.
Yeah. And like, would you say sort of that, even at that time when you guys were resisting the war by protesting in Lincoln, was that something that was on the mind in the educated community at that time, that the domino theory just...
Yeah, I mean, right after World War II, there was always this theory that President Roosevelt, basically because of physical infirmity, sold out to the Russians when they divided up Europe. I think it was the Potsdam Treaty. I might stand corrected, but I think that's what it was. And that communism was a dead mortal threat to America, and it was even further. That threat was even further extenuated when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, when President Kennedy was the president, because it looked like this domino theory was right. Like, here we're going to take communism from Europe, and now we're going to put it in Cuba, and the next thing it's going to do, it's going to be American minds are going to turn that way. So it made some superficial sense, this communist domino theory, that the North Vietnamese are communists, and then they're going to make the South Vietnamese communists. The Russians are going to make Cuba communists, and then the whole world is closing in on the United States from both directions into a communist world. So it made some superficial sense, but actually when the whole thing was laid bare by study, it was the North Vietnamese, I don't think, had any intention to make the whole world communist. I think they just wanted to reunite their country.
Yeah. Going back to that nationalism that was emerging.
Exactly.
So now we've sort of established how it was at UNL at the time when you were there. Can you recall what it was like, say, in Chapman at this time? Was it a different...
I can recall real well, because I went to the Baptist church in Chapman, and we had a preacher, a very capable, well-educated preacher who happened to be Hispanic. And he wore a peace button one or two Sundays to church. And there was a little button that I think it signified that your protest in the Vietnam War is a peace button. And these peace buttons were pretty well-known little things that a lot of people wore. Well, there was a segment in our church that really got after him, to the point where they quit coming to church, or they quit putting money in the offering plate, and eventually they caused him to resign. And I know my family was directly involved in that, but even though my parents were Republican, they saw how terrible that was to punish somebody for opposing point of view. So we all gave up our membership in the Chapman Baptist Church and joined the Methodist Church. And it was all over that.
Yeah.
And that's one example, one big example, in a small community, how that war affected our own community on a personal basis.
Yeah. Can you remember like conversations or any disputes, say, between people who were fine with him wearing that button, or those who weren't?
I remember a lot of conversations. I had arguments with people, and it'd get down to the point, well, and I think a lot of the people were conditioned by what I think was the righteous intervention of the United States in World War II. Yeah. And people were used to giving great deference because of World War II and its justifications to the military. So I think a lot of people, including World War II veterans, they were tuned into thinking, well, if our military is going to do this, it's unpatriotic to disagree with them.
Yeah.
And so that caused a lot of conflict, especially with people that had studied the situation in Vietnam and had come to the conclusion that it was not a just war. And so you're basically portrayed as unpatriotic by World War II veterans, and I can understand why. But it did cause a lot of arguments in the small communities between people who were fairly sure we shouldn't be there, and a lot of the patriotic community a lot of them were World War even World War I, World War II, and most recently than that, at that point, Korean War veterans.
Yeah. Did that have any...
And I think a lot of them, though, eventually, I don't want to say that they ever turned their back on their brothers in the military, because it wasn't their choice to be there. They were always for the soldier on the ground. But I think a lot of them, after the war drug on for many, many years, came to the conclusion that the guys are getting killed for no reason at all.
Yeah. Did that do you think there's any lasting, like, so I think now, like, with contemporary times, with it being so divisive, that it even puts a strain on relationships at times, but...
It put a strain on relationships right within people's homes.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were in college, like I was, and you had a father that had been a World War II veteran, there'd be a lot of arguments right in the house over it.
Yeah.
Although in my particular case, even though my dad was a veteran, I think he saw through the war.
Yeah.
He was always supportive of the Army, the troopers, and the Navy men, and the Marines, and Air Force, and so forth. But his disagreement was not with them, and his support was with them, but his disagreement was with the people that sent him there.
Yeah.
And that's the politicians.
Yeah. And so, like, going back to one of the earlier points we made when we were talking about your personal background, you talked about how it's really open in your household. Like, you as kids, you and your siblings could talk with your parents. Do you think that sort of helped that discussion of, like, this issue?
Oh, it definitely did, because none of us ever held it in our home. Might sound like I'm bragging here, but I had very, very bright parents. And to this day, even though I went to law school and even though I've argued cases against some of the better lawyers in the country, I think my mother was maybe the smartest person I ever met in my life, and my dad was right up there too. But they encouraged open dialogue in the house and differing views about the war for a period of time. It never got personal. I mean, it was just a thing where we each had our positions, and over time, I think my parents adopted my position. Not that I was always right about everything, but I think over the course of the Vietnam War, it became clear to almost everybody it was a mistake.
Yeah. Yeah. It was... So.
Well, I mean, look what happened. We were there 10 years. We had some of the greatest armaments in the history of warfare. We were the only country at that time who had ever dropped, and still are the only country that ever dropped a nuclear bomb on anybody. And we had all this military capability, and we're getting beat by a peasant-type army who were very skillful at camouflage, that were tenacious fighters. But I think people lost sight of why they were tenacious. They were tenacious out of I think if you talk to any soldier that fought the Vietnamese army face to face, and I know plenty of them, they were as skillful as any combat infantry units on the face of the earth or in the history of warfare. And I mean, they'd fight till death, but you have to say, why would they fight that hard? Why? And it was this ultra sense of nationalism that they had.
Yeah. Well, that I think that will work very well for the college years, draft, Vietnam, and student movements. Actually, got some really good points. I really liked the piece about
yeah, and there
Chapman.
were some kids killed at Kent State University protesting the Vietnam War, and that was one of the things that kicked off a lot of the protests in the United States, because well, there was issues about whether these students actually rushed these National Guardsmen there or what happened, but I mean, there was some deaths over the protests.
Yeah. So moving on from the college years of your life, I'd like to, because when I asked you about if you want to do this interview, you had told me some specific subjects that you would like to talk about. So I'll just give you a chance right now to talk about subjects such as, say, the moon landing, LBJ's legislation of civil rights.
Well, the moon landing was a big deal. And I'll never forget it. It was in I believe, the July of 1969. And we had been involved in this space race with the Russians. And the issue was, who's going to land on the moon first, the Russians or the United States? And so there was a tremendous amount of American resources, economic resources, that got diverted into the space program. And so the day that we landed on the moon, I'll never forget, we went to a farm, me and a couple of my friends, and we just had radios then, and we all sat around the radio, and the time came when the moon landing was supposed to happen, and there was a countdown, and I'll never forget, I believe it was Neil Armstrong was the first man on the moon, but the first words out of his mouth were, "The eagle has landed. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And there were national celebrations all over the United States because people viewed it as not only a triumph over the Russians, but a technological triumph, an engineering triumph.
Yeah.
Where at first we were kind of behind in the space race. The Russians put a man in space before we did. And so I think John Glenn was our first astronaut that went into space, but his was not a flight to the moon. It was a flight, I think an orbit around the United States maybe, and then a landing. But that all set the background for this race to the moon. But it was a big day in, I believe it was July 1969. I can't remember the day, but it was a national day of pride and celebration for beating the Russians, which I don't know that's what that really means, but for technological and engineering pride. It brought a lot of pride to the United States. And at that time, it was kind of a sense of pride the United States needed because we were still bogged down in the Vietnam War in 1969.
Yeah.
So even though it looked like we were not getting anywhere in Vietnam, or perhaps even losing the war in Vietnam at that point, it was kind of a refreshing thing to see, well, we can win at this. This is awesome.
So were you in college still when that was?
Yeah, I was a sophomore at the university. That was my second year in college, 69.
Was there like kind of excitement on campus after that? Like people talking?
Well, I wasn't. It was in the summer, so I wasn't on campus in the summer. But I know locally there was a lot of excitement. I mean, it was like a big national 4th of July celebration all over the United States. Even it was in July too, I believe. You can check that, but I'm pretty sure it was in July of '69.
I see. Yeah, I'm not for sure either.
That was a big thing. The thing I know the least about is the question you ask about the Civil Rights Act. Although I do know that President Johnson was the president when it happened. And I also know that up until that period of time, the South, basically the southern tier states like Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, Georgia, those states were traditionally Democrat.
Yeah.
And I remember that President Johnson, even though he was a Democrat, lamented at the time that he knew he turned the South Republican with a stroke of the pen, because a lot of people at that point still weren't ready for some reason. I guess racism, I don't know what else you could say. They weren't ready to accept the black people as equals. You have to understand that the big court case was in 1954. It was Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. So even though the Civil Rights Act was 11 years later, 10 or 11 years later, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education said separate in schools is inherently unequal, and that you cannot segregate black children from white children or any other race from any other race. Being separate is inherently unequal. But still, it's clear into the 60s there was hiring discrimination, subtle discrimination, and things that I believe the Civil Rights Act of 1965 tried to cure.
Yeah.
But it wasn't real popular with a lot of very conservative people.
Yeah. Well, so with that happening in 1954, that would have been the year right before the Brown versus Board of Education, right before you entered your first year of education in Chapman.
Yeah, it had been 1 year before.
Yeah. And I'm guessing Chapman was,
I didn't know anything about it until I was older, because I was just a kindergartner or a preschool guy.
Yeah.
I guess we didn't have preschool then.
Do you think it had any impact on, say, your mother as a teacher or anything like that?
I don't think it had any impact on my mother, but it was because of my mother's individual character. She always viewed people of any race or color as equal. And we were taught that at home. We were never, using derogatory terms about black people. I guess I was lucky. I was raised by parents who, I don't think they had a racist bone in their body.
Yeah.
I might have been somewhat unique at that time, but we were always taught that it's the content of it. This is a word from Martin Luther King, actually. It's a content of your character. It isn't the color of your skin that makes the difference, and we were always taught that. Yeah. Even before Brown, when I was probably 3 or 4.
Yeah. Well, moving on to the last subject I have here. So I'll just read kind of what I have here, but drawing to a close, I would like to just ask some questions that explain how these issues remained relevant in your life and the lives within your community after you graduated and after the 60s and 70s came to pass. When you earned your law degree and entered the workforce of these issues, such as the JFK assassination, Vietnam, social movements, can you describe conversations in the community, at work, or with families and friends that related back to these issues?
Well, I can give you one example that occurred right here in this office. I have defended a number of murder cases. And one of the experts that I used in those cases actually did the exhumation of Lee Harvey Oswald. And so, his name is Vincent DeMaio. He was the chief medical examiner in Dallas, Texas, and then the chief medical examiner in later years in San Antonio, or Bexar County, San Antonio, Texas. And I testified in a lot of very famous cases, but right here at work I was able to relate to a man that had been involved in the sense of doing the exhumation and report on of Lee Harvey Oswald. Beyond that, yes. In fact, I just read a book that I handed to you a little bit ago about the assassination of President Kennedy. It's not the only one I've read. I've read others. Basically, for the science of ballistics, I think there's some pretty compelling reasons to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was not a lone shooter in that case. The investigations that occurred after the death of Lee Harvey Oswald, after his death too, but after the death of President Kennedy, were pretty legally oriented. I mean, statements that mafia men made in Chicago. I was very interested in all this from a perspective of if I was going to defend one of these people in court, what happened, I think, this is just my opinion. When President Kennedy was elected, it was a very close election. And the theory was that the organized crime figures in Illinois delivered the Democratic vote for him that put him over the edge in Illinois that helped him capture the presidency. And almost immediately after he became president, he appointed his brother, Robert Kennedy, to be the Attorney General. And one of the first things that Robert Kennedy did was declare a war on organized crime. It infuriated the mafia. There's clear evidence that there were Chicago mafia figures in Dallas, Texas, the day President Kennedy was killed. There's also clear evidence that the ballistics didn't match the lone shot theory. The autopsy evidence indicated that President Kennedy was shot also from the front as well as from the back, which would have been impossible by one shooter. And why it's all relevant to my life, and to this day it's relevant to my life, is how you prove a criminal case. how you prove what happened. And there's been a lot of different very well-known authors that have done a lot of research on that. There were a number of mafia figures. Sado Traficante was the crime boss in Miami. He claimed on his deathbed that they killed him. And there were Carlos Hathcock. He was the subject of a book about the Vietnam sniper. Carlos Hathcock was a sniper in the Marine Corps who was reportedly the best shot in the world. And they tried to duplicate, he and a couple other of the best snipers in our military history tried to duplicate what Oswald would have had to done with a fairly poor rifle, a Manslinker rifle that not very reliable, the things don't shoot straight. But they couldn't do it. They couldn't even come close to doing it. And it was all based on this film called the Zapruder film. There was a novice photographer that had footage of President Kennedy actually being shot. But from that photo sequence, that video sequence, they were able to time how quick those shots would have went off, the shots. And the best shooters in the world couldn't duplicate it. In fact, there's a statement in there, I believe it's attributed to either Carlos Hathcock or one of his Marine sniper friends, that we know he didn't do it because we couldn't do it. I said, how do you know he didn't do it? And they said, because we couldn't. And these were two of the best shots in the world. But a lot of that thing, I reflect on it all the time, because in my personal life, I have defended cases where gunshots and how they occurred, the distances that they occurred, whether they were close shots, far shots. I learned a lot from studying the assassination of President Kennedy, let's put it that way, that I could apply to my own work as a criminal defense attorney.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if that answers this next question, but certainly that did have an impact on you.
I don't know if that the impact on me, but that's the impact it's had on me.
Yeah.
Professionally.
Yeah, in your career. But I guess just in case there is another issue, is there any issues that came to pass that you can describe having the greatest lasting impact on you, if it is anything other than, say, that itself?
From the 50s, or from the 60s or 70s, anything that had the greatest impact on me personally?
Sure, yeah.
Well, I think the greatest impact on me personally was that draft deferment.
Yeah.
Because had I not had that deferment, and had I been drafted, well, first of all, I might have gotten killed. Or would have I lost interest? I've always asked myself, if I'd have been gone 4 years, or 2 years, I think the draft was for then, if I'd have survived, would have I still had the urgent feeling I had to go to college, or would I have lost interest in intellectual things, or would anything that I may have seen of horrific nature of people being shot or hurt or disfigured, would have that prevented me from ever having the right mindset to go on for higher education? So I think probably the thing that had the most direct benefit on me, or not benefit on me, but the most direct effect on me, was that draft.
Yeah.
I guess I'll never know the answers to all that, because I had many friends that when I started law school, there were friends that came to law school that had already been in Vietnam and survived it and were in law school again. Because, see, I didn't start law school until 72, but the war had been going on since there's a famous movie out that actually a young man from Grand Island, his last name is Sawicki, went to senior high school. He got killed in the battle. It's made famous by Mel Gibson portraying General Hal Moore in a battle that went on in South Vietnam on November, I think, 14th, 15th, 16th, or 15th, 16th, and 17th of 1965. And it was a pitched battle. between thousands of North Vietnamese regular army troops. This wasn't a guerrilla thing. It was a pitched battle like you would have in World War II, and an American infantry division. In fact, I think it was Custer's old division, and there was a lot of likenings to whether the same thing was going to happen, but it's immortalized in a very famous movie that's been out called We Were Soldiers Once and Young, and there was a young man from Grand Island that was killed in that battle, and so soldiers that were there for a year at that time, 65 or 66 or 67, could be back in college if they survived by then. And I had at least 2 friends that had already fought in Vietnam and were back in the university by then. And of course, that was also one of the things that was going on, because what I'm getting at is here, they came back and they had some pretty sorry stories to tell. And of course, they were back on college campuses then trying to finish their education or further their education. And I think that played into a lot of the protests that went around in Vietnam. Because the ones I talked to that had been over there said it's a loser's situation.
Yeah. So they were.
So you're talking to people in college at my stage. I'm talking to people that had been there fighting, and they had a pretty dim perspective of the place.
Yeah, and they, because they probably came back and they experienced, at least watching these protests around, how'd they feel about that?
I can't say that I ever talked to any of them about it. I don't know whether it pleased them or hurt their feelings or how they felt about it. I think it was something that I didn't really care to ask them, because I didn't want to cause friction if there was going to be friction over it.
Yeah. Here's sort of just the last question I have to ask. Out of these issues, we talked about how they have a lasting impact on you. Any things that you view how maybe from the 60s and 70s brought change within your own community of Chapman? Or lasting impressions on people, or
that brought change within my own community. Well, I think the Vietnam War definitely brought change, because I think people came to realize that the United States military wasn't invincible. It was really hard to stomach. I mean, we couldn't figure out, why aren't we winning this war? We've got all this military stuff. We've got all, we're fighting a country, they don't really even have good jets. They don't have good airplanes. And we're losing. And it doesn't end. The theory was, it was a war of attrition. That's what the generals, Robert McNamara was the Secretary of Defense during a lot of that time. And he has later acknowledged publicly that he had made a mistake over this whole thing. They thought that if every day, we'd have troop kill counts that come on. Walter Cronkite, he was a big newscaster, well-known newscaster. Dan Rather was a young journalist who was actually on the ground in Vietnam at that time, reporting from the ground. He later became an anchor. But Walter Cronkite was the kind of the face of the news. He was a well-known broadcaster. But every night, or every day, they'd say, American losses in Vietnam today are 32 killed, North Vietnamese losses, enemy 432. That's just a wild number, I'm just making it up, but that's kind of what it'd be. 2 days later, American losses, 14, North Vietnamese, 528. And the theory was that if we keep killing people at this rate in Vietnam, that is far exceeding our rate of loss, that eventually they'll quit. We'll kill our whole army.
Yeah.
But it didn't happen. And the minute we'd kill some, there'd be thousands more right in the fight. And then there was another theory at the time that we can't win the war because we aren't invading North Vietnam. We're going to the demilitarized zone, but we're not flying north. where we were flying north. We were that's where John McCain got shot down, was over Hanoi. But we weren't putting land troops in north. And the theory was that if we push too hard, Russia will enter the war on the side of North Vietnam and will provoke a World War III. So I really felt, I remember having a bad feeling for the people that were in the military, because it was like they were fighting with their hands tied behind their back. But at the same time, I don't know, even if we'd had an all-out assault on North Vietnam, whether things would have really changed any. I have the same feeling right now about Iraq. I mean, yeah, we went there, we toppled their leaders and everything, but are we still going to have the kind of government there that we'd be proud of in the United States? That's the question. So I hope that's helped some. That's my perspective.
No, I think that was very helpful.